Okay, let's go ahead and get started writing a procedure. There's a couple of details we want to get clear first. Number one, we're going to be using a different database. So this is one that has had several of the things fixed from the test database. So be sure and change it to student U3. And then the next thing is we're going to actually drop the following procedure if it exists. So procedures are like tables in that you store them in the database and they can't be duplicated. So if you want to create a table, you need to make sure and drop it first. So it's kind of like that. So we're going to drop procedure if exists, and then the name of it. And we're going to call this procedure add user. And this procedure is going to help us to add user without any of those errors. So we're going to validate that everything's the way it's supposed to be as the scenario specifies, and then we'll add them. All right, now we actually get to create a procedure. And we're just going to simply create it, and then the things that you do is the name of it, and this is the add user. And then in parentheses you put a list of the parameters, and here it tells us what the parameters are, and these are really each value needed to insert a new employee and a new user, and I'm going to put them one line after another so I can keep track of what they all are. So there's a user ID. Notice that these are variables, so they start with the @ sign, and then they need the type, and this is the SQL Server database type that it needs to be. And this was an nvarchar, and it was 35. And then you put a comma, so a comma between each one. And then you just keep adding these one at a time. And I'm going to go ahead and pause this while I add them, and you can go ahead and add each of these values to yours. And once I've listed each of the parameters, then I'm going to put the closing parentheses to close that list of parameters that matches this opening parentheses there. Okay, the next one is the as command, and then after that we're going to be listing each of the different details. So let's do them one at a time. For the first one is test that a user ID is not already in the data. If it already is used, then we're going to print a specific error and end the procedure. So I like to test my queries before I do it. So what I want to do is I want to get all the user IDs. So select user ID from user 1. Now before I run this, I want to make sure I'm in the right database. I've got a whole bunch over here and lots of them have a user 1 table. So if I start using the wrong one, then I get different results than I expect. Student U3. And then I'm going to select user ID from user 1. And I execute that, and I get this really long list of user IDs. And I want to make sure that the one that I'm trying to insert isn't already in here. So this gives me the list of them. So I'm going to use that query. And I'm going to say if the parameter they sent me, which is @ user ID, is in this select statement. If it's in there, then there's a problem, right? And I'm going to do multiple things in this if statement, so I'm going to use a begin command. And the first thing I'm going to do is print an error message. So I'm going to print error. And I'm going to write something very specific so that they know what the error is. User ID is already used. And that's what's happening in this particular error. And using these messages then will give them feedback about what they're doing. And then we return. And return is how we end the procedure. It doesn't need a value. So one of the main differences between procedures and functions is procedures do something but not return anything, a value. And then functions do something and return a value, or just return a value. But this one's going to use the return to end the procedure. And then I'm going to end that if statement. Now I'm not going to add an else because if this is a problem, then we're going to print it and leave. If it's not, I just want to move on to the next statement. So I don't need an else condition to handle what happens if it doesn't go wrong. Now let's go ahead and execute this. Now notice I get this error. Create alter procedure must be the first statement in the query batch. So I always want to make sure I'm using the right one, and I always need to drop it if it exists. What I'm missing here is the go statement. So I need to drop it and go. That executes this statement, and then that will have the create execute first thing. So let's try that, and there it's working fine. And that's what I expected. All right, so now this procedure is in the database. And it's there and it's ready to use. So let's go ahead and use a new query. I'm going to leave this open here because I'm going to come back and do some more work here. But I'm going to open a new query here to test it. And what I'm going to use is one of these statements here. Notice how the format of this. So it's execute user, add user. And again, I'm going to make sure I'm using the right one. The right database. So execute add user, that's the procedure, and then I follow it with a list of all of the parameters. Now notice I don't need parentheses here, but I do need commas that separate them, and they need to be the correct type. Notice how the null is the null value, not the character null, and if there were numbers then we would add numbers. So now let's run this execute statement, and there we go. It worked. All we had it do was to print an error if there was an error. So let's go ahead and see if that actually works, because we didn't get it. We think we didn't get an error. So now we can force an error. We can go ahead and use a user ID that we know is in there. So I know this one is in there. And let's see what happens when we execute that. Oh, and sure enough, there's the error that we wrote. Error, user ID already used. So there we go. The procedure is working. It's doing just exactly what we wanted to do, and we were able to test it and make sure it works.